The black box recording from American Airlines Flight 2317 would later become Exhibit A in one of aviation's most shocking criminal investigations. Mayday, Mayday. This is AA 2317. Medical emergency on board. Requesting priority landing at SFO. Adult female. Status post-seizure. Captain Phoenix Ryder Callahan's voice was steady, betraying none of the calculated interest he felt watching the young doctor work in first class. At 32, he was the youngest captain in American Airlines history, a record achieved through a combination of exceptional skill and carefully cultivated relationships with the right people. Standing in his perfectly pressed uniform, Phoenix cut an imposing figure, 6'2" of calculated charm masking a predator's instincts. That January morning started as a routine transcontinental flight until the seizure at 35,000 feet. When Dr. Aria Sterling rushed to help, Phoenix watched through the cockpit door, noting every detail. Her emerald silk blouse rolled up revealing delicate wrists, long black hair falling forward as she worked, the quiet authority in her voice as she directed the flight attendants. 26, Yale Medical School, youngest neurosurgery resident at UCSF. He'd memorized her passenger manifest details before takeoff, a habit that would later raise red flags with FBI profilers. Landing in 8 minutes, he announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the same smooth confidence he'd later used to convince 2 separate women to marry him. The emergency landing was flawless, earning him both a commendation and Aria's phone number, the first thread in what would become an elaborate web of deception. Their courtship was a masterclass in manipulation. Phoenix learned everything about her Vietnamese parents' immigration story, her drive to prove herself in medicine, her weakness for aged Cabernet and ocean views. Each detail carefully filed away, each vulnerability noted for future use. Why neurosurgery? He asked during their first date at a rooftop wine bar, watching her fingers trace the rim of her glass. I like fixing things others consider impossible, she answered. The irony of her words would haunt her later. What Aria saw as a whirlwind romance was, in reality, a perfectly orchestrated campaign. Weekend trips to Paris, surprise deliveries to her hospital, late-night conversations about their shared ambitions. Phoenix played the role of devoted suitor while systematically dismantling her defenses. The proposal at Muir Beach seemed spontaneous. In truth, he'd rehearsed it for weeks, calculating the exact moment the setting sun would catch her engagement ring. Their wedding at the Palace of Fine Arts was a study in carefully constructed imagery. Phoenix, fighting artfully crafted tears as Aria walked down the aisle in hand-beaded lace. Her traditional Vietnamese family beaming with pride at their daughter marrying an accomplished pilot. The empty front row for his supposedly dead parents, draped in white roses. The first of many lies that would later unravel. The Victorian in Pacific Heights became their showcase, every detail selected to reinforce their perfect life narrative. The telescope in the bay window for stargazing, the shared study with its carefully arranged medical journals and flight manuals, the wine cellar stocked with bottles he'd later duplicate in another home, another life. But perfection requires constant maintenance. As their first anniversary approached, Phoenix felt the familiar itch, not just for freedom, but for the thrill of deception. He loved Aria, or at least the challenge she represented. Yet watching her methodically plan their future with surgical precision, he was already plotting flight paths to Chicago, calculating schedules and alibis. These opposite schedules are getting harder, Aria whispered one night, curled against him in their king-size bed. She'd just finished a 36-hour shift, smelling of hospital antiseptic under her jasmine lotion. You knew you were marrying a pilot, Phoenix replied, his phone already buzzing with details about next week's Chicago layover. Special Agent Diana Ramirez would later find this text, the first concrete evidence of premeditation. As Aria drifted off to sleep, Phoenix lay awake, his mind racing with possibilities. The perfect husband was about to orchestrate his greatest deception, unaware that every carefully plotted move was leading him straight into an FBI investigation that would shock the nation. In the FAA evidence locker, A flight log from that period contains a single note in Phoenix's precise handwriting. AA 2317, medical emergency, Dr. A. Sterling attending. Below it, barely visible, Chicago rotation begins February 1st. The first breadcrumb in a trail that would eventually expose one of aviation's darkest scandals. The Chicago air crackled with electricity the night fate dealt Phoenix his second winning hand. A hair diverted incoming flights as lightning split the sky, but Captain Phoenix Callahan insisted on landing AA 1221 himself, much to his co-pilot's concern. The Boeing 787 touched down with surgical precision through sheets of rain, a landing that would later feature in both his FBI file and love letters. Aurora Rory Winters was stranded in the first-class lounge, a splash of crimson against the sterile airport backdrop. 25, with untamed copper curls and a devil-may-care smile. She was everything Aria wasn't. Chaotic, spontaneous, dangerously alive. While his perfect wife performed perfect surgeries in their perfect San Francisco life, Phoenix found himself drawn to this flame-haired force of nature like a moth to destruction. "Looks like we're all stuck here tonight," he said, sliding onto the leather seat beside her at the empty airport bar. Lightning illuminated her profile, freckles scattered like constellations across pale skin, green eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade. "Good thing I know how to make my own fun, Captain," she replied, producing a flask from her vintage leather bag. The whiskey burned like her smile, raw, authentic, addictive. "Aurora Winters, but call me Rory. I own that little gallery in Wicker Park, the one with the controversial nudes in the window." 4 hours and several shared drinks later, they were running through the empty terminal, her laughter echoing off glass walls as security guards looked the other way. Phoenix's uniform still commanded respect, even when breaking rules. They ended up in the abandoned observation deck, watching lightning paint the sky while sharing secrets neither would tell another soul. "I escaped an abusive marriage at 23, Rory confessed, tracing the raindrops on the window. Art saved me. Now I save others through it. Survivors, outcasts, anyone society tries to silence." Phoenix felt something crack in his perfect mask. "My parents aren't dead," he heard himself say. "They're in federal prison for investment fraud. I rewrote my entire history to become the youngest captain. Nobody knows." That night changed everything. While the storm raged outside, they came together like colliding stars, passionate and reckless on the observation deck's cold floor. It was nothing like his measured lovemaking with Aria. This was primal, desperate, real. Or perhaps just another perfectly executed performance. The FBI would later debate this point extensively. Their affair blazed like wildfire. Phoenix began manipulating flight schedules, creating elaborate patterns of layovers in Chicago. Each visit was an escalation. Midnight skinny dipping in Lake Michigan, making love in her paint-splattered studio, dancing in underground jazz clubs where nobody knew Captain Callahan's name. Rory awakened something in him that Aria's surgical precision had never touched. With his Chicago lover, Phoenix didn't have to be perfect. She celebrated his darkness, encouraged his wildness, never trying to fix or change him. Her gallery became their sanctuary, where he'd watch her paint for hours, both of them spattered in colors that would later become evidence stains. "You're my freedom," he whispered one night, taking her against a canvas that would later sell for thousands, their passion literally becoming art. "My escape from everything I'm supposed to be." The dual life required increasingly complex logistics. Phoenix created separate phones, email accounts, even different colognes for each city. He studied flight patterns obsessively, crafting schedules that would keep his worlds from colliding. Every detail was meticulously planned, each alibi carefully constructed. The same methodical mind that made him an exceptional pilot now orchestrated the perfect crime. For months into their affair, during a sunset flight in a small chartered plane, paid for in cash, a detail that would later interest prosecutors, Phoenix proposed. The ring was nothing like Aria's elegant diamond. Instead, a raw black opal, chaotic and beautiful like their love. "Marry me," he said, flying dangerously low over Lake Michigan. "I know we'll have to keep it quiet because of airline politics, but I want you to be mine." Rory, who hadn't known about Aria's existence, found the secrecy romantic rather than suspicious. They married at midnight in a 24-hour chapel, with fake names on the license, another red flag that investigators would later uncover. She wore a red dress that matched her hair, bare feet decorated with ankle bells. No photographs were allowed, a rule Phoenix insisted on: fourth privacy. But maintaining two marriages required more than just careful planning. Phoenix began transferring funds through a complex network of accounts, using his knowledge of airline systems to create ghost flights and fake expenses. He rented a luxury apartment in Chicago under a shell company, filling it with the same high-end amenities his San Francisco home boasted. The perfect husband now lived two perfect lives. In San Francisco, he and Aria hosted sophisticated dinner parties and attended medical galas. In Chicago, he and Rory threw wild gallery openings and danced until dawn in underground clubs. Each wife fulfilled a different need. Each life satisfied a different part of his fractured soul. Late one night, as he lay in Rory's paint-stained sheets while Aria worked a night shift 3,000 miles away, his Chicago wife traced the airline wings on his chest. "Sometimes I think you're too good to be true," she murmured. Phoenix kissed her deeply, tasting whiskey and freedom. "Maybe I am," he replied, not knowing that in 9 months, both his wives would discover just how true those words were. In the evidence room at FBI headquarters, there's a painting from that period. A man with two faces against a storm-dark sky, wings made of broken glass. Rory's signature in the corner, dated the night of their wedding. The art experts called it prescient. The prosecutors called it Exhibit C. Spring 2013's FAA flight logs would reveal an intricate pattern. Captain Phoenix Callahan's rotations between San Francisco and Chicago resembled an elaborate dance, each step calculated, each movement precise. What investigators didn't see were the two distinct lives blooming at either end of those flight paths, each one perfect in its own way, each one built on exquisitely crafted lies. In San Francisco, Thursday evenings belonged to Aria. She'd leave the hospital early, trading her surgical scrubs for elegant cocktail dresses that made Phoenix's breath catch. Their dining room would glow with candlelight as they hosted intimate dinner parties for the city's medical elite. Phoenix played his role flawlessly, the sophisticated pilot who could discuss neurosurgical procedures as easily as wind patterns. "Your husband is remarkable," Dr. Harrison Chen, chief of neurosurgery, commented one evening as Phoenix expertly decanted a 1982 Bordeaux. "It's rare to find someone who understands both the technical and human aspects of our work." Aria beamed with pride, reaching for Phoenix's hand across their antique mahogany table. "That's why I married him. He sees the complexity in everything." If they only knew just how complex, Phoenix thought, his wedding ring catching the candlelight. The same hand had worn a different ring just 2 days ago in Chicago. 3 nights earlier, he'd been with Rory in a grungy underground jazz club, her red hair wild as she danced barefoot on the bar. Their Chicago nights were electric, spontaneous motorcycle rides along Lake Shore Drive, painting nude portraits in her gallery after hours, making love on paint-splattered floors. "You're different here," Rory whispered one night, tracing paint-stained fingers across his chest. "Freer. Like you're finally letting yourself breathe." She wasn't wrong. With Aria, every move was choreographed, every word measured. With Rory, he could let the darkness out to play. The duality should have torn him apart. Instead, it made him feel complete. The close calls started in April. A delayed flight from O'Hare meant Phoenix almost missed Aria's hospital fundraiser. He changed from one suit to another in an airport bathroom, carefully wiping Rory's signature red lipstick from his collar. That night, accepting an award for Aria's pediatric brain surgery research, his hands shook slightly as he held the microphone. "My wife inspires me daily," he said, meeting Aria's loving gaze while his phone buzzed in his pocket with messages from Rory. Her dedication to healing others makes me want to be a better man. May brought another near disaster. Rory decided to surprise him at O'Hare, not knowing he was on an unscheduled flight to San Francisco where Aria's mother was in the hospital. The sight of Rory's red hair in the terminal sent him into a cold sweat. He diverted through the crew entrance, texting her that his flight had been rerouted to Denver. That night, holding Aria as she cried about her mother's condition, guilt gnawed at him like a physical pain. The logistics became increasingly complex. 2 sets of credit cards, 2 cell phones, 2 wardrobes carefully curated to never overlap. He maintained separate email accounts, social media profiles, even different ways of speaking. With Aria, his vocabulary was precise, clinical. With Rory, he let his words run wild and free. June brought the first real crack in his perfect performance. At a gallery opening in Chicago, Rory introduced him to her newest artist, a neurosurgeon who created sculptures from medical waste. Dr. Sterling's work is revolutionary, the artist said. Her paper on pediatric trauma changed the field. Phoenix's hand tightened on his whiskey glass. Sterling, he managed, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Aria Sterling? The neurosurgeon in San Francisco. The artist continued, oblivious to Phoenix's tension. She's speaking at a conference here next month. That night, Phoenix lay awake in Rory's loft, plotting flight schedules and contingency plans while she slept beside him. The next morning, he manufactured an emergency training rotation that would keep him away from Chicago during the conference. But it wasn't just the logistics wearing him down. The emotional toll was becoming unbearable. He loved them both, differently, but genuinely. Aria was his North Star, her brilliance and grace giving him the status and stability he craved. Rory was his freedom, her wild spirit allowing him to embrace the chaos he'd spent years suppressing. July brought another complication. Aria began talking about starting a family. My biological clock is ticking, she said over breakfast in their Pacific Heights kitchen. And you're not getting any younger, Captain. 3 days later, in their Chicago apartment, Rory painted his portrait while discussing their future. I never wanted kids before, she said, mixing colors on her palette. But with you, I can imagine it. Phoenix felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to close in. The idea of children with either woman filled him with equal parts longing and terror. A child would make his double life nearly impossible to maintain. Yet the thought of choosing between them was unbearable. The guilt began manifesting physically. Insomnia plagued him during long flights. His perfect landing record slipped slightly. First Officer Jade Martinez noticed his hands shaking during turbulence, a detail she'd later report to investigators. August brought another near miss. Both wives decided to send care packages to his long layover in Dallas. The packages arrived at his crew lounge simultaneously. Phoenix spent an hour in the bathroom, hyperventilating, before carefully redistributing the contents and sending each box to its respective city. That night, in the cockpit at 35,000 feet, he caught his reflection in the darkened window. Which version of himself was real? The polished professional who matched Aria's perfectionism step for step? Or the passionate artist's muse who could lose himself in Rory's chaos? September marked their wedding anniversaries, carefully spaced 3 months apart. For Aria, he arranged a private concert at Davies Symphony Hall, her favorite violin concerto echoing through the empty auditorium as they danced. You make every day feel like a fairy tale, she whispered against his chest. For Rory, he borrowed a small plane, paying cash, always cash, and flew them to a secluded beach in Michigan. They built a bonfire, drank whiskey from the bottle, and made love under the stars. You make me feel infinite, she said, her hair glowing like embers in the firelight. Both statements were true. Both moments were perfect. Both women had pieces of his soul. And each day, the weight of his deception grew heavier. Late one night, flying back from Chicago to San Francisco, Phoenix reviewed his roster of lies. The separate credit cards and phones. The elaborate flight schedules. The careful cataloging of stories to never mix up details. It had become a full-time job managing his dual existence. First Officer Martinez's voice cut through his thoughts. Everything okay, Captain? You seem distracted lately. Phoenix forced a smile, adjusting his heading by 2 degrees. Never better, he replied, the lie falling from his lips as easily as "I love you" did in two different cities. Below him, America slept, its cities gleaming like stars. Somewhere in San Francisco, Aria was probably falling asleep over medical journals, her face serene in the soft light of their bay window. In Chicago, Rory would be in her studio, painting through the night, her canvas splattered with colors that matched her wild heart. Two perfect wives. Two perfect lives. One imperfect man flying between them, never suspecting that his carefully constructed world was about to hit turbulence no amount of skill could navigate. In the cockpit voice recorder from that night, later retrieved by the FBI, Phoenix can be heard humming a tune. The analysts identified it as Two Different Worlds, an old jazz standard about impossible love. Even his subconscious, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The first sign of Phoenix's perfect world unraveling came on a rainy October morning in Chicago. He was rushing to leave Rory's loft, already late for his flight to San Francisco, when she grabbed his hand and pressed it to her stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Phoenix," she whispered, her green eyes shining with tears. "I took 3 tests this morning." Time seemed to stop. Outside, thunder rumbled, nature's own warning signal. Phoenix felt the ground shift beneath his feet as Rory continued talking, her words blurring together. 8 weeks, morning sickness, doctor's appointment. 3,000 miles away, Aria was attending a fertility seminar. "Your wife's timing couldn't be better," First Officer Jade Martinez commented during pre-flight checks that afternoon. "My sister did IVF at the same clinic. Heard they're working miracles there." Phoenix's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the throttle. He didn't respond, his mind racing through scenarios, each more impossible than the last. In the coming months, this moment would replay in the cockpit voice recordings, analyzed by FBI specialists for signs of premeditation. The pressure mounted from both sides. In San Francisco, Aria's traditional Vietnamese family began their campaign for grandchildren. Her mother shipped fertility tokens and herbal teas. Her father, during their weekly dinners, pointedly discussed the importance of carrying on the family name. "My colleagues ask when we're starting a family," Aria confided one night, curled against him in their bed. "I told them we're trying. They weren't, of course." Phoenix had been carefully avoiding that conversation, making excuses about timing and careers. Now, with Rory's pregnancy, his carefully constructed house of cards began to sway. In Chicago, Rory's pregnancy progressed with the same wild abandon that characterized their relationship. She painted her growing belly with swirling colors, documented every change with artistic photographs. Phoenix found himself flying more frequently to Chicago, inventing training sessions and emergency coverage. Senior flight attendant Luna Mackenzie noticed first. "Captain Callahan's been volunteering for a lot of Chicago routes lately," she mentioned to Jade during a layover. Strange. With his wife doing fertility treatments in San Francisco. The first serious mistake came in November. Phoenix accidentally used his Chicago credit card for a dinner with Aria's hospital colleagues. He spent a sleepless night transferring funds and fabricating expense reports, but the transaction had already caught the attention of American Airline's fraud department. Rory's gallery scheduled a major showcase for December, the same week Aria's hospital planned their annual charity gala. Phoenix's attempts to manipulate the flight schedule grew increasingly desperate. He called in favors, traded routes, even fabricated a training requirement. "Something's off with these logs," Luna murmured, reviewing the crew schedules. 20 years in the air had given her a sixth sense for irregularities. She began keeping notes, dates, discrepancies. The pregnancy complicated everything. Rory experienced severe morning sickness, calling Phoenix at all hours. Twice he had to excuse himself from dinner with Aria to talk Rory through panic attacks. Each close call frayed his nerves further. During a particularly rough flight through mountain turbulence, Phoenix's usual steady hands shook visibly. "Maybe you should take some leave," Jade suggested, concern evident in her voice. "You seem stretched thin." If she only knew. Phoenix was running on empty, surviving on airport coffee and anti-anxiety medication. His perfect memory, once able to keep every detail straight, began to slip. He called Aria Rory during an intimate moment, covering it by faking a coughing fit. Then came the FAA notification. Routine audit of flight hours and rest periods. Phoenix spent a weekend fabricating documentation, but the inconsistencies were mounting. His systematic violation of rest period requirements hadn't gone unnoticed. December brought the final straws. Both wives, unknown to each other, began planning anniversary surprises. Aria booked a romantic weekend in Napa, while Rory arranged a private showing of her pregnancy-inspired art collection. The stress began showing in his performance. A rough landing in Denver. A missed radio call over Nevada. Small mistakes that would never have happened before. Each incident documented, each report filed, building a paper trail that would later become evidence. Then came the morning Phoenix had dreaded. Rory's 12-week ultrasound showed twins. "Isn't it incredible?" she sobbed happily, showing him the sonogram. "Two perfect little lives we created." That same evening, Aria greeted him with her own news. The fertility clinic called. "We have an appointment next week. They're very optimistic about our chances." Phoenix locked himself in their elegant bathroom, gripping the marble counter until his knuckles turned white. In the mirror, his reflection showed a man he barely recognized, drawn, haunted, unraveling at the seams. The final piece fell into place when Luna Mackenzie connected the dots. A magazine left in the crew lounge, Rory's gallery featured in a Chicago arts publication. A photo of the gallery owner, very pregnant, very much in love with a man whose face was artfully shadowed but whose airline wings were clearly visible. Luna took her suspicions to Jade. Jade compared her notes on Phoenix's schedule changes. Together, they began to see the pattern. "We have to report this," Luna said finally. "His judgment's compromised." It's not just about him anymore. The official FAA investigation began quietly. Phoenix, distracted by juggling 2 pregnancies and 2 anniversaries, didn't notice the extra scrutiny of his flight logs. Didn't see the investigators photographing him in both cities. Didn't realize his perfect world was about to implode. In the last cockpit recording before everything fell apart, Phoenix can be heard reciting flight coordinates for both San Francisco and Chicago, his voice increasingly desperate as he mixed up the numbers. The black box transcript ends with a single, haunting phrase. How long can a man live in 2 different skies before he falls from both? The answer, as everyone would soon discover, was exactly 14 days longer. The beginning of the end started with a phone call at 35,000 feet over Nebraska, a moment that would later be dissected in courtrooms and FBI briefing rooms. "Captain, emergency call from Chicago." The flight attendant's voice crackled through Phoenix's headset. "An Aurora Winters Callahan. She's at Northwestern Memorial. Something about complications with the twins." Phoenix's hand froze on the throttle. Beside him, First Officer Jade Martinez's head snapped up at the name Callahan. After weeks of gathering evidence with Luna, this was the confirmation she'd been dreading. "It's the twins," Rory sobbed when he called back. "My blood pressure's through the roof. They're saying preeclampsia, Phoenix. The doctors, they're talking about emergency C-section if it doesn't stabilize. I'm scared. I need you here." He was 4 hours into a San Francisco-bound flight, where Aria waited with color-coded fertility treatment schedules and a calendar marked with optimal conception dates. His perfectly orchestrated dual life was disintegrating at cruising altitude. "Medical emergency," he announced, his voice carrying the same authority that had helped him maintain this charade for so long. "We need to divert to Chicago." "But sir," Jade protested, checking their fuel gauges, "we don't have the fuel reserves for." "I said we're diverting." The edge in his voice made several passengers look up in alarm. This outburst would later become item 47 in the FAA's investigation file. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Aria's methodical mind was assembling pieces of a puzzle she never wanted to solve. It started with a health insurance billing error. Coverage claimed at Northwestern Memorial in Chicago. Then credit card statements showing duplicate charges. Same dates, different cities, impossible distances. Her surgical precision, once devoted to saving lives, now excavated her husband's lies. The Dallas incident was the first public crack in Phoenix's perfect facade. Running on 3 hours of sleep, juggling frantic calls from Rory's doctors and increasingly probing questions from Aria, he missed a critical warning light during landing. Only Jade's quick intervention prevented catastrophe. Enough, Luna cornered him in the crew lounge afterward, her 20 years of flight experience evident in her unwavering stance. "I know about Aurora. About the twins. About your elaborate schedule manipulations. This isn't just about your marriages anymore. You're putting lives at risk. Phoenix's response sent chills down her spine. His usual charm dropped away, revealing something darker. You don't understand. I love them both. Different parts of me need different things. I can't lose either of them. You're going to lose everything, Luna warned. Including your wings. She was right, but not in the way she imagined. American Airlines' annual Excellence in Aviation Gala was approaching in Dallas. Phoenix, nominated for Pilot of the Year due to his supposedly exemplary record, had to attend. What he didn't know was that Aria, originally scheduled to present at a medical conference the following week, had moved her plans forward after finding suspicious text messages on his backup phone. And Rory, released from hospital observation with strict instructions to rest, had decided to surprise her husband at his moment of triumph. She'd never seen him receive an award, never shared his professional achievements publicly. At 7 months pregnant with twins, she felt she deserved this one indulgence. The security footage from the Dallas Fairmorn would later be played in slow motion for FBI analysts. 3 separate elevators carrying 3 people toward an explosive convergence. Phoenix in elevator A, resplendent in his dress uniform, practicing an acceptance speech he'd never give. Aria in elevator B, elegant in midnight blue silk, clutching a phone containing months of gathered evidence. Rory in elevator C, radiant in a flowing maternity dress that showcased her twins, holding a congratulatory bouquet. Phoenix spotted Aria first, her surgical grace unmistakable as she crossed the lobby. His phone buzzed, Rory texting she was 5 minutes away. For the first time in his storied career, the man who could land a plane in zero visibility had no escape route. He moved quickly, decades of emergency response training kicking in. A text to Rory, emergency in cockpit, meet me at the south entrance. Another to Aria, stuck in pre-ceremony briefing, save me a seat. But fate had other plans. Rory's Uber dropped her at the north entrance, the closest to the ballroom. Aria, suspicious of every word now, was already walking toward the pilot's briefing room to verify his story. Luna watched it unfold from her position near the check-in desk. She'd arranged her schedule specifically for this moment, knowing all the players would be in place. Her hand hovered over her phone, ready to dial FAA investigators who were already in position. The security footage shows Phoenix breaking into a run at 8:42 p.m. At 8:43, Aria rounded the corner toward the briefing room. At 8:44, Rory's red hair appeared in the lobby. Time compressed. Phoenix reached Aria first, trying to steer her toward the bar. But she stood her ground, years of operating room authority evident in her stance. Enough lies, she said, her voice carrying across the marble floor. Who is Aurora Winters Callahan? The name hung in the air like smoke. And then, as if summoned, Rory's voice. Phoenix? Baby, where are you? The twins are going crazy tonight. They know their daddy's getting an award. The footage shows the exact moment Aria's world shattered. The precise second Rory's smile faltered. The instant Phoenix Callahan's perfect lives collided. What happened next would fill depositions and newspaper headlines for months. 2 brilliant women processing betrayal in real time. One man's web of lies unraveling in spectacular fashion. And somewhere above, a storm system moving in, grounding all flights, nature's own contribution to ensuring no one could escape this reckoning. The last clear image from the security footage shows Phoenix standing between his wives, his wings gleaming under hotel lights, as both women realized they were married to different versions of the same carefully crafted lie. But even this wasn't the end. Because at that exact moment, in a cruel twist of fate or cosmic justice, Rory's face contorted in pain. Her hands clutched her belly as she doubled over. The twins, it seemed, had decided this was their moment too. My babies, she gasped, and both Phoenix and Aria moved forward instinctively. The pilot and the doctor, the husband and the stranger. The man who had loved them both and betrayed them both, now watching his worlds collide as dramatically as any mid-air collision he'd trained to avoid. The last words captured on the security footage, before chaos truly erupted, came from Luna. I need medical assistance in the main lobby. And someone call the FBI. The Fairmont's Grand Ballroom had hosted countless galas, but none quite like this. Security footage timestamped 8:47 p.m. shows 300 of aviation's elite witnessing the implosion of Captain Phoenix Callahan's carefully constructed life. You're having his twins? Aria's voice cut through the cocktail chatter. Her surgeon's hands, steady enough to operate on infant brains, trembled as she faced Rory. "I'm his wife." "That's impossible," Rory gasped between contractions. "I'm his wife." The room fell silent except for Rory's labored breathing. Phones emerged, recording the moment American Airlines' Golden Boy crashed and burned. "Someone call an ambulance," Phoenix commanded, trying to take control like he would in flight turbulence. But Aria stepped forward, her medical training overriding personal trauma. "I'm a neurosurgeon. Get her on the ground. Now. Those twins are coming." Her voice was ice-cold, professional. "And someone call the FBI. My husband's under investigation for flight safety violations." Luna had already made that call. Federal agents were moving through the hotel even as Phoenix watched his wives, one administering medical care to the other, realize the full scope of his deception. "BP's dropping," Aria announced, checking Rory with equipment from her medical bag. "We need emergency transport. These babies are in distress." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The betrayed wife potentially saving her husband's other family. Phoenix tried to approach, but hotel security blocked him. His Pilot of the Year award sat forgotten on the podium. "Northwestern Memorial's too far," Aria said, her brain automatically mapping Chicago's hospitals. "Rush University Medical Center. They have a level 3 NICU. Rory screamed as another contraction hit. "Phoenix, tell her she's lying. Tell her this isn't true." But Phoenix Callahan, the man who could talk his way through any situation, stood mute. His perfectly pressed uniform seemed to suffocate him as he watched both his worlds collide. The media arrived before the ambulance. Smartphones had already sent the story viral. Airline captain's double life exposed at awards ceremony. Twitter exploded with photos of the glamorous neurosurgeon wife treating the pregnant artist wife. Phoenix's breakdown began quietly. First, his wings pin clattered to the marble floor. Then his captain's hat. Finally, as paramedics rushed in, he sank to his knees. "I loved you both," he whispered. "Different parts of me needed different things." "Save it for your FAA hearing," Luna said, handing federal agents a thick file of evidence. "And your bigamy trial." The ambulance ride became its own drama. Aria, still in her evening gown, monitored the twins' heartbeats. Rory, through tears of pain and betrayal, asked questions no one could answer. Were any of his promises real? Does he have other families? Other children? Outside Rush University Medical Center, reporters had already gathered. The story was too perfect. 2 wives, twins in distress, a hero pilot's fall from grace. Cable news crews set up live shots as Rory was rushed into emergency surgery. Phoenix arrived in police custody, his uniform wrinkled, his facade finally cracked. He looked old suddenly, vulnerable. Not the man who commanded jets across continents, but a scared boy caught in his own web of lies. In the operating room, Aria watched through the observation window as her colleagues performed the emergency C-section. Her medical mind catalogued procedures while her heart processed betrayal. "Baby A is out," the surgeon announced. "Baby B following." 2 perfect boys. Their features a mix of Rory's delicacy and Phoenix's strength. Aria felt something break inside her. Not just dreams of her own children with Phoenix, but the entire fairy tale she'd lived. The media circus intensified. Pilot's double life ends in dramatic delivery, scrolled across screens nationwide. Aviation blogs dissected his flight patterns. True crime podcasters speculated about other possible families. Phoenix's breakdown became complete in the hospital waiting room. Security cameras captured him screaming about flight patterns, about loving both women, about needing different versions of himself to feel whole. "I could land a plane in any condition," he sobbed as FBI agents led him away. "Why couldn't I land this?" The final footage shows 3 lives forever altered. Rory, recovering with her newborn twins, Aria, removing her wedding ring beside an incubator, and Phoenix, his captain's stripes now replaced with handcuffs, being led through a gauntlet of reporters. Above them all, through the hospital windows, planes continued their perfect patterns across the Chicago sky. But Captain Phoenix Callahan would never fly those skies again. 3 months after the Dallas incident, 3 courtrooms in 3 different jurisdictions rendered verdicts that would finally ground Captain Phoenix Callahan. The FBI's investigation revealed more than just bigamy. Financial fraud, falsified flight logs, violated safety protocols, each discovery adding years to his sentence. But it was the testimony of his wives that sealed his fate. Aria took the stand first, every news channel carrying live footage of the neurosurgeon's measured destruction of her husband's character. He didn't just deceive us, she testified, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. He risked passengers' lives, manipulating flight schedules to maintain his lies. The man I married was as fictional as his flight logs. A week later, Rory testified via video link, her twins asleep in the next room. He made both of us believe we were living fairy tales, she said, tears streaming. But he was just a skilled pilot navigating between two manufactured realities. The twins, Alexander and Adrian, became social media sensations. Born 6 weeks premature during the scandal's explosion, their progress captured public imagination. Photos of Aria visiting them in NICU went viral, the betrayed first wife helping save her husband's secret children. I couldn't punish innocent babies for their father's sins, Aria later told Time magazine in an exclusive interview. As a doctor, as a human being, I had to help. Phoenix's attempt at explanation came through a 60-page letter sent from federal detention. I loved them differently but completely. Aria was my ambition, my drive for perfection. Rory was my freedom, my escape from that same perfection. I needed both to feel whole. But in trying to have everything, I lost myself. The FAA's verdict was swift, permanent revocation of his pilot's license. American Airlines terminated him and implemented new verification protocols dubbed the Phoenix Rules. Aria threw herself into her work, pioneering a new pediatric brain surgery technique that earned her international recognition. Colleagues noted she worked harder, stayed later, as if trying to rebuild her life one saved child at a time. The same precision he used to deceive, she told the medical board, I'll use to heal. Rory's path to healing took a different route. Her gallery showcased a new collection, broken flight patterns, massive canvases depicting fractured wings and shattered compasses. Critics called it a masterwork of betrayal and redemption. The twins thrived despite their dramatic entry into the world. Rory moved them to Maine, opening a smaller gallery where her boys could grow up away from their father's shadow. Phoenix received 15 years in federal prison for the combination of his crimes. His cellmate would later report that he spent hours folding paper airplanes, perfect in their symmetry, launching them between prison bars. 1 year after the Dallas incident, Aria and Rory met privately at a Chicago cafe. No cameras, no reporters. Just two women who had loved and been betrayed by the same man. I keep asking myself if any of it was real, Rory said, showing Aria pictures of the twins. All of it was real, Aria replied, her surgeon's clarity cutting through confusion. That's what makes it worse. He loved us both. He just loved himself more. The final footnote to Phoenix Callahan's story came in an aviation psychology journal. His case became required reading for flight crews, a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of technical excellence and personal deception. In their last communications, both women received identical messages from prison. I'm sorry I couldn't choose. I'm sorry I had to have both sky and earth. Aria never responded. Instead, she channeled her pain into becoming the youngest chief of neurosurgery at UCSF, her precision now legendary in operating rooms across the country. Rory's response was her most valuable painting. A massive triptych showing a man torn between two worlds, his wings melting like Icarus as he tried to inhabit both. It sold for enough to fund her son's college education. The twins grew into curious, artistic boys with their mother's red hair and their father's intense eyes. They never visited Phoenix in prison, but sometimes, on clear nights, Rory would catch them looking at the sky, watching planes trace patterns between stars. In the end, the man who could navigate through any storm couldn't find his way through the turbulence of his own heart. Captain Phoenix Callahan, the pilot who needed 2 homes to feel complete, found his final landing place in a cell measuring 8 by 10 feet. Proof that sometimes the highest flights end in the hardest falls. The last image, 2 women who survived their fairy tales turning to ash. One saving lives with steady hands, the other creating beauty from pain, both finally free from the man who thought he could command not just the skies, but love itself.